Hello, this is Stephanie.
And this is Brian.
Welcome to our podcast, The Making and the Remaking of a Codependent Mind.
This episode is going to be part 2 of what we started in the previous episode.
Right. So last episode, we started on Brian's 12 steps, which is your attempt to codify the 12 steps that you took to address your codependency and change the codependent behaviors that have become habitual for you.
So if you're listening to this one first, I would recommend you go back to that episode and listen to that one first, because we covered the first 5 of those steps, as well as discussed the problems we found with the original 12 steps, being AA or CODA. So these steps are really not meant to be like, do these steps in this order or anything. It's kind of just an inspiration for anyone listening on like how they can use this as an idea for their own reprogramming.
Exactly. So like you said, we're going to be covering steps 6 through 12 in this episode. And again, it was season 3, episode 12, where we did the first 5 steps. Before we get to the next 6 steps, though, I just wanted to say something that we usually say at the end of the podcast, when I don't know how many people listen to the very end of the podcast. So we just want to mention how grateful we are that when people reach out to us and give us feedback. We're also very grateful, even just a like or a follow or a review on the podcast platform that you listen on. It helps other people find the show as well, which we're grateful for. But let's dive into steps 6 through 12. Did you want to read 1 through 5 first?
I guess might as well just read the steps really quickly just to kind of get ourselves going down the path. Okay, so they are: 1, I admitted that I was powerful, that my life could be manageable. 2, I came to believe that human interpersonal relationships are a core feature of an enriching life experience, and that my habitual codependent behaviors were holding me back from having that experience. 3, I made a decision to listen to what my emotions are telling me and to understand the ways in which I had been avoiding or burying those emotions. 4, I made a searching and fearless inventory of all the relationships in my life, past and present, what effect those people's behaviors had on me, and the effects my behaviors have had on those people. And then 5, I admitted to another human being that I value and trust the exact nature of those behaviors and relationships to the best of my ability.
So those are the first 5. We're going to put all 12 in the show notes, but let's move on to 6.
Number 6. So number 6 is, I was entirely ready to face the shame and fear that I had been bearing or avoiding, asking for help from others when necessary.
I'm going to quote Freud here, and we should have been reading Freud all along because there's a bunch of great quotations from Freud, which makes sense because he really introduced a number of key concepts, key psychological concepts that we've been talking about: disassociation, repression, compartmentalization. Mm-hmm. And this one kind of has to do with compartmentalization or repression. It's unexpressed emotions will never die. They will come back forth in uglier ways. So you were carrying all this shame and fear right back since your childhood. And as we've talked about over the course of these episodes of this podcast, you kept adding to that shame and fear bucket ball. We talked about it in a number of kind of physical metaphors that just got added to as you went through your life, especially when you were in those abusive relationships. And that shame and fear didn't go away.
Right.
And it would present itself in these codependent behaviors.
Yeah, it's this constant game of kind of reshuffling these memories and thoughts into different compartments, as we say, because I didn't know how to resolve them. I didn't know what they were. And every time any of them crossed my mind, it just made me scared again or ashamed again.
And in avoiding facing the shame and fear, like Freud is suggesting, it made it worse. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And more difficult. And they got bigger and bigger and scarier and scarier.
Yeah. The original ones did, and then I added new ones. Mm-hmm. So the behaviors that I wound up doing, things like dishonesty, just added more shame. Yeah. And now I have completely new circumstances that I'm now ashamed of in an attempt to avoid the original shameful.
So one way that people talk about codependency showing up is as perfectionism. that's a thread that goes through the codependency literature, that, that a number of people, an aspect of their codependency is perfectionism. So in that case, again, their shame and fear that they're carrying from childhood is showing up in this kind of excessive need to control their environment and be perfect in everything that they do.
Yeah.
And you can see that kind of as this fear of fear, which we've talked about, fear of shame, like being unwilling or unable or not feeling ready to face any amount of fear or shame, such that even just picking a restaurant to have dinner at is this loaded experience. And you'll see someone maybe who's a perfectionist spend hours trying to choose exactly the right restaurant, because what happens if they choose the wrong restaurant? They may feel some amount of shame.
Right. Failure, something.
Failure, right.
And then even then
they can't deal with it.
And then even then, once at the chosen restaurant, choosing the right meal. Like, here's another round 2, you know? So yeah, I had elements of that.
You did.
Yeah.
What seems in retrospect kind of excessive planning. Yes,
exactly. So that's, maybe not necessarily, I wouldn't describe it as perfectionism, but it's a similar thing. It's the same kind of mechanism. I overplanned lots of things throughout my life. I mean, to the point of where I wasn't actually doing the thing I was planning. Like, I tried to have a music career at one point, but I spent years just researching how to do it right. And then once I finally did it, oops, I didn't actually want to do this. So that can go for so many things. Yeah, but I also overplanned with the restaurant thing, like you're talking about too. So I just couldn't imagine being able to deal with just choosing the wrong restaurant. Like, if I felt as though I had some way to control something in this future experience, I was gonna go out of my way to make sure that there was no way that was gonna go wrong. I'm gonna look at every restaurant on Yelp or whatever it is and just make sure it's the absolute best for every meal.
And one reason I brought up that example, because people might have the question, well, what does that look like? Being ready to face shame or fear. So what that might look like, and that's actually an example, you have given up that excessive planning. You are now much more willing to just go to a restaurant.
Yeah.
And it may not be the perfect restaurant, and it may actually go poorly, but just not doing that excessive planning, you are taking on a little bit of fear that things might go wrong. And if things do go wrong, recognizing maybe you're feeling a little bit of shame, but then learning to release yourself from that shame, because that's not an actual shameful event.
Right. Yeah. And then each time I deal with it that way, I start to build this momentum and trust in myself that I can actually deal with it when things don't go exactly perfectly. I mean, we've had times where we go to a restaurant, it's not even open. Oops, we forgot to check that it was open. Fine.
That's true.
Let's just go somewhere else.
Yes.
It's not the end of the world. But that would be the kind of thing that just would send me over it. So part of the thing is my capacity to handle it was also affected by the fact that I was carrying so much. So I was just at my edge at all times because I didn't deal with any of the ones that already came my way, and I was just carrying those. And then any literal shame or fear that came on, it was just like, this is too much. I can't. And then I just keep trying to shove it somewhere wherever it could fit,
And we talked about learning to manage your emotions, particularly shame and fear, in season 2. I think the episode's called Emotional Maturity. Maybe we'll link to that one in the show notes, because we recognize you because you went through it, and I because I witnessed it. This is really tough.
Yeah.
These are very difficult emotions.
This is painful emotions.
Very painful emotions. And so being ready to face them, it can be hard to get there for sure.
Yeah, and that's what I felt myself doing, like also what we talked about in season 2, where even though I didn't really know much about any of this stuff yet, I felt like I was doing the right thing by facing it. Like it's just, I feel like I need to do this. Now, on hindsight, I'm really glad I did that, because I had to. That was the only way to get through any of this stuff.
So right, it was a critical step. But why that second part's included, asking for help from others when necessary. It's included because it is so difficult. And you did that as well. There would be times where we'd be talking about an event in your past or in our past that was causing you shame. And you'd say that. You'd say, I'm struggling here. I need a moment, or I need some help.
Yeah, I'm naming it not just for myself, but for you too. So yeah, it's just to make it clear, because it is difficult. Yeah, when facing shame, especially before I got more used to it, it was triggering. So I went into that kind of freeze mode whenever I felt shame. And it's hard just to have a conversation
And most of what you were carrying shame about and most of what you were carrying fear for was not real, was not things that you should be ashamed about, and was not things that you needed to be afraid of.
Right.
So
false signals.
So asking for help to manage that shame and fear, I think, made a difference, because a lot of it was helping you talk through and think through the ways in which those were false signals, as you say.
Yeah. So I had to get used to being able to feel it, one thing, so that moving forward, whenever something caused fear or shame in me, I would deal with it appropriately, look for the signal, because that's what they are. That's as we've said many times now, that our emotions are a signal. So if I'm afraid, what am I afraid of? Just be able to actually look at that and not go, I'm afraid. I need to figure out some way to avoid this fear or the shame. Oh no, I don't want to feel this. So I had to figure out a way to avoid it. It's just listen to it, even though it's hard.
And ask for help if you're not sure that you're getting the right signal.
Yeah. So another big thing that I had to use to be able to get used to the shame and fear for was rewriting my stories, like we've talked about. So I had to go back and do all this work to re-examine my past, re-examine my relationships, things I did, how those things affected other people, kind of like we talked about during the first 5 steps. I had to be ready for the fear and the shame that came from thinking about those things, so that I could successfully get to the truth of each of those things.
And speaking of getting to the truth, step 7.
So step 7 is I searched for the root causes of all my maladaptive behavior patterns and worked on strategies for healing from the effects of those causes.
So part of this is, even when we got the codependency framework, you didn't just say like, I'm codependent.
Yeah.
That's the explanation.
Right. Yeah, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of the previous episode where we started on these steps was that I think it's more helpful to not see codependency as something you heal from. So I'm not healing from the codependency. Codependency is the result of the thing that I need to heal from.
Yeah, even though we call it healing codependency, we do.
I know that's
we do
true.
Use that language, but
yeah, we have. But really, technically, for me, I had to heal from what was at the root, which was trauma, because trauma is what got encoded in my body, and the codependent behaviors were my response to that encoded trauma. So I had to heal the trauma to be able to address the behaviors.
Behaviors came about as defense mechanisms against the trauma you were experiencing. And in your case, it was kind of chronic repeated trauma. And then those behaviors became habitual and in that way maladaptive, because then you were applying them to situations where they didn't work. They were not helping you.
They weren't necessary, and actually they had the opposite effect. They
effect.
Wound up getting me trapped. So I was suspended in this kind of state, as if that childhood friend still had control over me. And then I just assumed pretty much everybody I came in contact was that guy.
Right. In some cases, they were.
Yeah, right.
And when they were, you got stuck in those relationships.
Doing the exact same things I did to keep myself safe with that guy when I was 7 years old.
There's a really good book on trauma. I'm not sure if we mentioned it. Maybe we have. The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, I think we did.
We'll link it again in the show notes if we haven't. But it's an excellent book about trauma and how it happens and the ways that it reverberates throughout your body and throughout your life if it's not addressed. And there's a part in it where the author talks about the ways in which often behaviors that we see as problematic, for instance, addictions to food, kind of expressed as obesity, or addictions to alcohol, might actually be strategies for coping with the unhealed trauma. So that they themselves are not the problem again. They are the solution. They're a bad solution,
yes,
often.
Exactly.
I mean, an unsustainable solution, but they are the solution the person has for dealing with this unhealed trauma. And that's in some ways your codependent behaviors as well. They were solutions to unhealed trauma. So there's no use to simply remove those behaviors if the trauma is still unhealed. Much like you stopped drinking, that was a coping mechanism for dealing with trauma and stress and abuse. You stopped drinking, and it didn't solve the problem.
Yeah, it didn't solve what caused me to drink too much. Fine, I could just continue to not drink, but so what? Like, what did I help there? Some of these behaviors, obviously, I want to not have the codependent behaviors. But if I'm not replacing it with anything, or I'm not reprogramming the source cause of it, then it'll probably just come out some other way.
Yeah, I mean, just go back to my favorite Freud quote now. The emotions, the fear and the shame are still unexpressed and undealt with, and they're going to come forth later, whether that's as codependent behaviors or alcohol abuse or...
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced it myself, but I've seen this before in other people too, where it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to stop drinking. Well, now I'm going to overeat. You know, there's going to be, just find something else, find some other vice, and it's really not much different. Maybe it's healthier somehow or something, but it's still an obsession. You're still searching for some way to heal your thing that you're not addressing.
To go back to what I was saying about perfectionism, and codependency can come out as perfectionism. Usually perfectionism is not a pathway to a satisfying and contented life. Mm-hmm. It seems to reflect a lot of ongoing anxiety and distress.
All right, so the next step then is 8. I made a list of all my wants, needs, desires, values, and expectations for my life and for my relationships.
I don't know if we've told this story before. It's kind of a funny story. Oh, we find it funny now anyway.
Yeah, right.
Early in our relationship, when I was learning a lot more about your relationship with Jay, including witnessing some of that dynamic, and you were doing that balancing act where you were trying to make it clear that she was not a good partner, but also not wanting to admit that it was a terrible relationship.
Yeah.
So that was confusing to me as someone entering in a relationship with you. And I suggested that maybe it'd be a good idea if we talked about what each of us expected as a bare minimum from the people who were in our lives, especially the people that we were engaged in intimate relationships with. And so you went off, as you often did, and wrote it out.
Yeah.
And then read it to me. And I said, something to the effect of, okay, these are your expectations, but it doesn't sound like you had any of that in your relationship with Jay, but you're saying that relationship was fine.
These are your bare minimum expectations. Yeah, you didn't have
so right, and then you responded with,
yeah. I said well, this is just aspirational though.
Yeah, well, this is ideal. This is what I want.
Right.
I would like, and I was like, okay. I mean, it's good to have an ideal, but I'm asking, what's your walk away point? At the bare minimum, someone has to treat me like this. Like, I won't accept these kind of behaviors. And this goes back, maybe we brought this up in the boundary discussion because it's more kind of about boundaries. But yeah, so it turns out, I guess, that you had never thought about that.
No, I never actually thought about it because enough of me knew that it was just an awful relationship, and I was constantly having to write stories to rationalize my being there. And this simple question of you asking this was just, my response was just so bizarre, right? I mean, it makes sense that I would actually, if I were to apply thought to it, I would have to come up with something. I can't say, because
I just
literally
take whatever
got
I get
from that relationship with Jay.
So, I mean, now I even know more from the relationship with R.
Yeah, right. Not only did I not get anything I got the opposite. I got nothing but bad things from those relationships. So if I were to apply any expectations at all, right off the bat, anyone I could say is already broken. So yeah, it forced me to go well, crap, does that mean I just completely had none? Yeah, I didn't. But I couldn't think about that when you asked me this question. So then that's why I just kind of backpedal and go, oh, wow, there's just ideal world, whatever, But
as we started moving through this process, though, and you started journaling and reflecting, you realized that it had felt unsafe for most of your life, going back to your childhood, having expectations, let alone wants, needs, and desires. So you just got used to not having them, not thinking about them.
Not even thinking about them. Yeah. So if for whatever reason I was on my own, but I never really was. I don't think I've, even a couple of times I lived by myself, but I never felt like I was truly an agent. I always felt like I had to answer to something or someone or other people or something. Yeah, I was never an individual. Yeah, it was too risky for me to have wants, needs, and desires. So I had to line myself up as quickly as possible to whoever came along. And if that was someone terrible, oops, now I'm lining myself up with someone terrible.
And this again illustrates this, how narcissism and codependency seem to be the two sides of the same coin, right? So we have narcissists who have this deep sense of entitlement that all their needs and wants and desires and expectations be given to them and be met. And then you have a codependent person who does not feel entitled to even have wants, needs, and desires and expectations.
Right. So it's pretty simple formula there.
Right. That's a scary combination.
Yeah. So I need to make, because I needed to know who I was. I needed to know what the starting point was here. How can I rewrite these stories and get self-awareness if I don't even know who I am to begin with? What are my values? So yeah, I mean, I wrote out a few lists throughout this. Like I started with a core values one at the very beginning of all this research, just to make sure I understood what it is I wanted to line myself up with before I started figuring out what my behaviors were. And then later kind of did a complete list of wants, needs, expectations. Once I started to get a little bit more of a grasp of what my emotions were and what love felt like and things like that.
Then step 9.
So step 9, using that list, I made an honest attempt to look at the big picture of my life to see which of my actions and which of my relationships were or weren't serving my well-being.
Right. So what kind of person did you want to be and what types of people did you want in your life? Which is kind of what I think was trying to get at in that early question was, what kind of relationships do you want? And what are you
expecting out of this relationship?
Mm-hmm. And you do that now. You've talked about the way you do that now with your family and with your job and with your friends. And
Yeah. So, there's certain relationships that I decide, okay, obviously there were ones that now I wouldn't even dream of getting into to begin with. I hope. I feel as though it wouldn't happen at this point. But if somehow, say, a coworker or something like that comes along and I really kind of have no choice, I'm sort of just deciding how I respond to that person.
Because you can still remove yourself from them as much as possible.
Yeah.
Even within a professional space.
But or like my family. I want my family to be part of my life. Their behaviors aren't always what I would consider to be great behaviors, but I have expectations. I understand who they are as individuals, and I understand who I am.
And that leads into step 10.
Yeah, so step 10 is I continue to cultivate my ability to recognize what power I have and how I can apply that power to make changes I need to make or accept things I can't change.
So this sounds similar to the Serenity Prayer.
Yeah.
We had a whole episode on that, which is kind of a discussion of this step.
Mm-hmm. It's basically baking the Serenity Prayer into the steps. It's its own step. And this is a throwback to step 1, being that I recognize that I have power.
And you need to use it
I
effectively.
need to figure out how to use it when it's appropriate and when it's, or when I don't have power.
Right. Understand its limits.
And then step 11 is I continue to watch how I use my language and for the motivations behind my initial reactions to situations or other people's behaviors. And when they resemble what I understand as codependency, promptly correct myself. So this is something that is an ongoing thing and probably will be an ongoing thing for a very long time. But the language, things like language is very important. It's kind of funny, but as we've said before, I abuse the word we, just kind of whenever it's convenient to like relieve some of the fear, I guess, of making a decision or taking responsibility for something. I just slap a we on it and it's like, oh, we liked that or something. And we were talking about, we had a jar, actually. It was I don't know if it was a jar, it was like a bowl or something, but with little beans.
Right.
And I would put a bean in a jar every time I said we in an appropriate way. And then there was kind of like different levels. Certain we's were even worse. It was, ooh, that's a 3-bean we.
I think the highest level was reserved for when you used we to represent, say, a shared mental state. We think this.
Yeah.
Or we like this. And you got it wrong.
Oh, sure, right.
I didn't think that, and I didn't like that.
Right.
So yeah, like 2 would be, maybe say we think or we like and getting it right, but then 3 would be
actually getting it wrong.
Getting it wrong. So you're not only bringing me in unnecessarily, because you can just express your own thoughts and likes and desires, but you were bringing me in when I didn't even belong in there because I was not part of the team that liked that thing.
Yeah, or like doing something like we did this. Remember when we did? Well, you did that.
Right. Yeah. So that would be wrong too.
I was nearby.
That's true. That would be pretty wrong.
Yeah.
But we have both used the word we multiple times during the last few minutes. It's not like it's always inappropriate.
No.
But it seemed there were absolutely times where it seemed a remnant of your codependent habits.
Yeah.
And we've talked about all the way through, codependency involves habitual behaviors that had been habituated over years. That's that's hard to break. It's hard to break any kind of habit.
Yeah, and it may sound benign in the grand scheme of things. Language, semantics or whatever. But really it's important because there's something behind it. It's not just straight up, when I'm saying that, there is some fear behind it.
Right.
So I want to make sure I recognize that. I have to be conscious of that. And so every time I make myself conscious of it, you help by making me conscious of it, it's huge. It's slowly reconditioning myself. So this is called classical conditioning, where I'm kind of coming up with a new replacement habit in place of it. So if every time I say an inappropriate we, I become conscious of it and I say, "Oop, I did this."
Right.
There we go. I'm trying to like just hammer that in to my head. So maybe next time, if there's like a moment of fear in my head, I'm still going to say I'm going to recognize it. I'm going to just go through it.
And eventually that becomes habitual.
Yeah. That becomes the new habit.
You get used to talking about yourself in the first person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, like I said, it's more about there's more to it than just language. So I find it helpful to keep that in mind.
Oh, I think absolutely. It became a window into talking about what you were feeling when you were making those statements.
Yeah. Right.
And the lingering habitual fear that you had from expressing wants, needs, and desires, or deciding to do something, or having an opinion about something that might be controversial.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You may not like my opinion, but I have to be okay with that. All right. And then finally, number 12, having gained the self-awareness and wisdom that has come from taking these steps, I commit to making all of these new behaviors my habitual behaviors. So that just takes what we were talking about in the previous one just a little bit further. It's kind of like it's sinking into the feelings of power, trust, individuality, emotional connectedness, and then just this overall self-awareness that I've now gained, and then just kind of getting this momentum and trust in myself from time and time again, behaving in this new way, the new replacement habitual behaviors. Each time I find myself doing one correctly out of the gate and not having to correct myself, like, there we go. There's a little bit of like momentum, and it just keeps building exponentially.
And like we said last episode, it's not that these steps are in exact order or something, but they kind of are, roughly represent your journey through this process. But sometimes you go back to certain ones and just kind of get a re-up on any particular step, but you haven't ever seemed to need to go back all the way to the beginning.
The very beginning being step one?
Yes.
I think I have. I think I've had to do that too. Sure. I think there's times where I need a little help recognizing that I'm powerful.
Right.
Because
that's true.
Feelings of powerlessness, it pops up in kind of small ways, not in the grand ways it used to. Mm-hmm. But yeah, on an average week or something, there may be a couple of moments where one of is in more than just language, but it may be language based, where it's just like, wow, that was a very powerless statement. Yeah, I mean, the universe is out to get me. Powerlessness is a thing that I still slip into sometimes, which we didn't actually talk about, and we regretted not talking about that.
And that came up recently. We're trying to sell our house, and you have a friend who has sold many houses, and she seems to always time it right and have the right house, and they always sell super quickly. And you brought her up because ours hasn't sold immediately, and you'd brought her up before, actually, when you had sold previous houses. This is clearly something that really sticking with you. And I was kind of, what does it matter how quickly her house sells? It's nothing to do with us or what it's going. But it was this kind of, because her house sold, the universe was out to get you. Like your house should be able to sell that quickly, and why didn't you get it? And of course, you didn't get it for lots of reasons. I mean, some of which you had control over and some of which you don't. But you just kind of just defaulted into, this just happens to me.
Yeah. So that led us into a discussion about this kind of other form of resentment, like kind of resentment towards the universe. But really resentment that you're powerless over the whole universe. And things happen, and then it just gets overblown. Like, oh well, that's my luck, this is what happens to me.
There's nothing I can do, right? Which even with selling our house, if we listed it lower, we could have sold it quicker, or if we listed at a different time, and we there are decisions that we made that have to do with how fast or slow it's going to sell, like they're decisions your friend made.
Yeah, and so if something isn't happening, say I'm not selling the house quickly enough, it's not that difficult to just step back and look at the reasons and to say, like, oh, well, what do I have control over and what I don't? A lot of it I don't, and a lot of it I do. Like you just said, the fact that we chose to sell it when we did, it can be a factor. There's a lot of factors, but just by going, the universe doesn't want me to sell this house.
So yes, I guess it's true. You do go back even to step one.
Go back to the beginning. Yeah.
I guess because you are getting used to what it feels like to move through the world as an autonomous, powerful person. So yeah, it makes sense that there would still be times where you don't feel that. I guess what I was trying to bring up is that it doesn't seem to be as difficult. It's not as emotionally fraught.
Right.
Having gone through these steps, you can go back and address them, and it's not terrifying anymore.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't take much to get me back on track. So yeah, we had like a 10-minute conversation, and not only was I back on track, I had a much more thorough understanding of the whole situation.
So you fall off the wagon sometimes, but you get right back on the horse.
Yeah.
I want to mix our metaphors there.
Right.
So there they are.
Yeah, those are the 12 steps, the new 12 steps.
And by all means, if other people have suggestions or edits or their own steps, we'd love to hear about those.
At this point, we've decided to wrap up this season and start in on a new set of topics that is going to be along the lines of relationships.
Codependency and relationships.
Yeah, codependency and relationships, and just elements of healthy relationships.
And we'll start on that in a couple weeks, and we hope you join us.